She was left alone at her sister's wedding, then ended up on a private jet with a mysterious billionaire. Humiliated at her own sister's wedding, Jane is at her breaking point. In an act of silent rebellion, she abandons everything and accepts a shocking proposal from a mysterious guest. "My jet leaves in an hour. Come with me." He is William Thorne, an enigmatic billionaire with eyes that seem to see right through her. The offer? A seat on his private jet, bound for an island in Italy. What begins as a desperate escape from humiliation quickly turns into a mystery. Why would such a powerful and controlled man make such a reckless offer to a complete stranger? Why does he protect her with a silent ferocity, yet keep her at a distance with walls of ice? Trapped in his luxurious Italian villa, Jane realizes this was no casual rescue. There is a reason he chose her, a dark secret in his past that connects him to her in a way she can't understand. She fled from a broken heart, but she may have fallen into a much more dangerous game, where the man who saved her is the greatest enigma of all. Let's begin. The music for the bridal party procession began to swell, a triumphant melody that felt like a personal mockery to Jane. She stood at the back of the church, the scent of lilies and old wood polish thick in the air, her bridesmaid bouquet trembling in her hands. The spot beside her was painfully, humiliatingly empty. Lucas, her boyfriend of 5 years, the man who was supposed to be walking her down this aisle, was gone. No call, no text, just a void where he was supposed to be. She felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on her as she was forced to walk the long, lonely aisle by herself. Each step was an agony, each pitying glance from a guest, a fresh sting of humiliation. It was the culmination of years of being let down, of being the responsible one, the one who always waited, always understood. In the middle of her sister's happiest day, she had never felt more invisible. Later, at the reception, she found him. Lucas finally appeared, weaving through the crowd, his tie askew, a half-empty glass of champagne in his hand. The familiar cloying scent of his whiskey-laced breath hit her before he even reached her. "See?" he slurred, a sloppy grin on his face as he tried to pull her into a hug. "I told you I'd make it." Something inside Jane, something that had been bending for years, finally snapped. With a calm that was terrifying even to herself, she gently pushed him back. She reached up, took the simple commitment ring he had given her 2 years ago, and dropped it into his glass of champagne. It landed with a soft, final plink. "It's over, Lucas," she said, her voice quiet, steady, and utterly devoid of emotion. She turned away, leaving him sputtering, and walked toward the bar, needing a drink, needing to breathe. As she stood there, a tall, impeccably dressed man who had been watching the entire exchange from a distance approached her. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, his presence cutting through the noise of the party. He had intense, indecipherable eyes and the controlled stillness of a man who owned every room he entered. He stopped beside her. "That," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine, "was the most honest thing I've seen all night." She looked at him, a stranger, and felt a sudden, reckless impulse. "And now I'm going to do the second most honest thing," she said, downing her champagne in one go. "I'm leaving." "Where will you go?" he asked, a flicker of genuine curiosity in his eyes. "Anywhere but here," she replied, her voice breaking slightly. He was silent for a moment, his gaze intense, as if he were solving a complex equation. "My jet leaves in an hour," he said, the words so absurd, so completely out of place that she almost laughed. "Come with me." Jane stared at the stranger, her mind struggling to process his words. "Are you insane?" she whispered, the question a breath of disbelief. The offer was ludicrous, the kind of line a man like him, radiating power and the subtle, expensive scent of woody cologne and clean starch, would use on a woman he thought was vulnerable. Probably, he admitted, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He introduced himself with a simple, William Thorne, a friend of the groom. He didn't offer pity. He didn't offer comfort. He offered an escape. Think of it as a reset, he said, his voice a low, persuasive murmur. A temporary reprieve from all of this. He gestured vaguely at the glittering artificial party. No questions, no expectations. Just a different place to wake up tomorrow. He paused, letting the offer hang in the air. I'm heading to my private island in Italy. The sheer, casual extravagance of the statement was like something from a movie. It was a fantasy, a dangerous, reckless fantasy. But a part of her, the part that was shattered and bleeding on the floor of her sister's wedding reception, was undeniably tempted. Before she could respond, her sister, the bride, rushed over to her, her face a mask of frantic concern, not for Jane, but for the party's decorum. "Jane, what was that with Lucas?" she hissed, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "People are staring. Can't you just handle it? You know how he is." She glanced over at William, her eyes widening slightly with recognition and curiosity, before turning back to Jane. "Please, just go home quietly. Don't make a scene. Not tonight." The words were a final, devastating blow. It wasn't just Lucas who saw her as a reliable, convenient shock absorber for his own chaos. It was her own sister. The person she loved most in the world also saw her not as a person in pain, but as a problem to be managed. The last of her composure crumbled, replaced by a cold, hard, and utterly liberating resolve. She turned her back on her sister. She looked at William Thorne, at his intense, waiting eyes, and saw not a stranger, but an exit. An escape hatch from a life spent taking care of everyone but herself. Her eyes, no longer filled with tears but with a new, reckless determination, met his. "Is your offer still on the table?" 20 minutes later, Jane was sitting in the back of a black, silent car, the city lights blurring past the window. She was still in her bridesmaid dress, a beautiful lilac-colored gown that now felt like a costume from a different life. She hadn't gone back to her apartment. She had nothing but the small clutch purse in her hands. She had simply walked out of her sister's wedding and into a stranger's car. The recklessness of it was both terrifying and exhilarating. They arrived at a private airfield, a world of quiet efficiency and understated wealth. A sleek, white private jet waited on the tarmac, its engines humming softly. Jane stepped out of the car and onto the tarmac, the cool night air a shock against her skin. The sheer scale of William's world was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just a man with money. This was a man who commanded his own reality. The flight was tense. The interior of the jet was a study in minimalist luxury, cream leather seats, polished dark wood, and the quiet, almost imperceptible hum of the powerful engines. William, true to his word, asked no questions. He settled into a seat across from her, opened his laptop, and was immediately absorbed in a complex-looking spreadsheet. The scent of his cologne, that familiar mix of woody notes and fresh starch, filled the small cabin, a constant, unnerving reminder of his presence. Jane felt completely out of place. She was a runaway bridesmaid, a guest in a fairy tale she hadn't been invited to. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape began to fade, replaced by a gnawing, creeping regret. What was she doing? She had just run away with a man she didn't know, a man who was clearly powerful, possibly dangerous, and who looked at her with the same detached interest he might give a new stock acquisition. She stared out the small window at the dark, empty sky, her own reflection, a ghostly image in the glass. A wave of loneliness, so profound it was a physical ache, washed over her. It was then that the plane suddenly lurched. A violent shudder ran through the cabin, followed by a sickening drop. Jane, who had always had a secret, deep-seated fear of flying, let out a small, strangled gasp. Her hands flew to the armrests, her knuckles white. The plane dropped again, more sharply this time. The seatbelt sign chimed, and the pilot's calm voice came over the intercom, speaking of unexpected turbulence. But Jane wasn't listening. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The cabin felt like it was closing in on her. "Hey!" William's voice cut through her panic. He was no longer looking at his laptop. He was leaning forward, his eyes, sharp and analytical, fixed on her face. "It's just turbulence. It's perfectly normal." I don't like flying," she stammered, her voice trembling. The plane shuddered again, and she couldn't stop the small cry that escaped her lips. She squeezed her eyes shut. She felt a sudden warmth envelop her hand. She opened her eyes. William had moved to the seat beside her. He had taken her hand, his own large and warm and surprisingly strong, his grip firm and steady. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice a low, calm murmur. "Just breathe with me, in and out." He didn't let go. As the plane continued to buck and shudder, he held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it in a slow, steady rhythm. He didn't offer platitudes. He just offered a solid, grounding presence. For the first time, he wasn't a spectator. He was there, with her, in the storm. When the turbulence finally passed and the plane settled into a smooth, steady flight, he didn't immediately release her hand. The silence in the cabin returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the cold silence of strangers. It was a silence filled with the lingering warmth of his touch, the echo of his calm voice, and the undeniable, shocking intimacy of the moment that had just passed between them. Jane awoke to the gentle sound of waves and the scent of salt and jasmine in the air. She was in a vast, sun-drenched bedroom, the white linen curtains billowing in a soft sea breeze. For a dizzying moment, she thought the entire insane night had been a dream. She got out of bed and walked to the French doors, pushing them open. Before her was a breathtaking view of the Mediterranean Sea, its waters a brilliant, impossible blue. She was in a magnificent villa, perched on a cliff, surrounded by lush gardens of bougainvillea and olive trees. On a small table she found a fresh set of clothes, simple linen trousers, and a soft cotton shirt, laid out for her. Beside them was a note, written in a sharp, decisive hand, on thick, expensive paper. "Make yourself at home. The house is yours. W." She explored the villa. It was beautiful, filled with art and light, but like his penthouse, it was strangely impersonal. It felt like a luxury hotel that had been perfectly staged but never lived in. She felt like a bird in a beautiful gilded cage. Later that morning, William appeared. He had changed out of his suit and into a simple dark polo shirt and trousers. The casual clothes made him seem younger, more approachable, but the wall of cool detachment was firmly back in place. "I trust you slept well," he said, his tone polite but distant. "I did, thank you." "This place is incredible," she replied, feeling awkward. "I find it efficient for escaping the noise," he said. He then invited her for a walk, not as a romantic gesture, but as a host showing a guest the grounds. He led her down a winding stone path to a small bustling fishing village nestled in a cove below the villa. And here a different man emerged. He was no longer William Thorne, the billionaire CEO. He was just Will. He greeted the local fisherman by name, his Italian fluent and easy. He stopped at a small, family-run cafe, ordering them both espressos and arguing playfully with the old woman behind the counter. Jane watched, fascinated. Here, surrounded by the simple, authentic life of the village, he was relaxed, charming, almost happy. The cold, controlled man from the jet seemed like a distant memory. As they sat at a small table, sipping their coffee, the old woman from the cafe, a tiny matriarch with eyes as dark and sharp as olives, came over. She smiled a wide, toothy grin at Jane, then turned to William and said something in rapid, musical Italian. Jane didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. The woman patted William's cheek affectionately. William's face, which had been so open and relaxed, instantly tensed. A flicker of discomfort, of annoyance, crossed his features. "What did she say?" Jane asked, her curiosity piqued. He took a slow sip of his espresso, avoiding her gaze. "Nothing important," he said, his voice once again cool and distant. "She was just commenting on the weather." It was a lie, a blatant, obvious lie. And just like that, the wall was back up, higher and colder than before. But the old woman, seeing Jane's confused expression, leaned in and in heavily accented but clear English, patted Jane's hand. "I said," she repeated, her eyes twinkling as she looked from Jane to a now frowning William, "that it is good to finally see you bring someone with light in her eyes to this place. Do not let this one escape, my boy." The comment hung in the air, a confirmation of his lie and a testament to the warmth he so desperately tried to hide. William's jaw tightened, and he stood up abruptly. "The tour is over," he said, his voice clipped. "We should go back." "Com certeza, o muro dele subiu novamente. Agora ela vai descobrir o porquê." The easy camaraderie of the village evaporated the moment they returned to the cold, silent villa. The wall between them was back, thicker and more impenetrable than ever. William retreated to his study, and Jane was left to wander the beautiful, empty rooms, the old woman's words echoing in her mind. "Do not let this one escape." That evening, the silence at dinner was heavy, suffocating. Jane couldn't stand it anymore. "Why did you bring me here, William?" she finally asked, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Really?" He looked up from his plate, his expression a mask of cool indifference. "I was bored," he replied, his voice flat. "You were a momentary diversion." The words were a deliberate cruelty, a cold splash of water designed to push her away, to re-establish the distance he so clearly craved. And they hurt, more than she wanted to admit. "A diversion?" she shot back, her own anger rising to meet his coldness. "Is that all I am to you? A toy you picked up to entertain yourself for a weekend?" "Isn't that what you agreed to?" he countered, his eyes like chips of ice. "A transaction, a flight to a new place in exchange for your company." "I thought it was an act of kindness," she cried, her frustration boiling over. "I thought for a second that you were actually a decent human being." In her anger, she gesticulated wildly, her hand knocking against her wine glass. The glass tipped, sending a wave of deep, red wine splashing across the pristine white wall and onto the corner of a large framed painting. "Oh my God," she gasped, jumping up, her anger instantly replaced by horrified panic. "I'm so sorry. I'll clean it." She grabbed her napkin and rushed toward the painting, but William was on his feet in an instant, his voice a sharp, guttural command. "Don't touch it." He moved past her, his body rigid. He didn't look at the wine stain on the wall. His entire focus was on the painting. With a reverence that was completely at odds with his usual cold demeanor, he reached out and gently touched the corner of the canvas, where a few drops of red wine had splattered. "Leave it," he said, his voice a choked, raw whisper she had never heard before. It was a portrait, a stunning, vibrant painting of a woman with fiery red hair and a smile that seemed to light up the canvas. She was beautiful, full of life, and she had William's eyes. "It was the last painting my mother ever finished," he said, his back still to her, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. She was driving home from her studio after completing it. There was an accident. The pieces clicked into place. The impersonal houses, the aversion to emotion, the way he had flinched at the old woman's mention of light in her eyes. His arrogance wasn't a personality trait. It was armor, a fortress built around a wound so deep it had never healed. "What happened to her?" Jane asked, her own voice now a gentle, quiet whisper. He was silent for a long moment. When he finally turned to face her, the mask was gone. In its place was the raw, unguarded grief of a 15-year-old boy who had lost his entire world. "She was in love with a man my father didn't approve of," he said, his voice breaking. "She was leaving him. For good. Everyone always called it an accident. But I know the truth." He looked at her, his eyes dark with a lifetime of pain and suspicion. My father killed her. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and horrifying. My father killed her. The words recontextualized everything Jane thought she knew about him. His cynicism, his need for control, his emotional distance. It was all a shield, forged in the fire of a catastrophic, defining tragedy. He didn't offer any more details, and she didn't press. He simply turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving her alone with the stained painting and the ghost of his mother. Later that night, she found him on the dark, silent beach below the villa. He was standing at the water's edge, a solitary figure staring out at the vast, black expanse of the sea. She walked up beside him, the sand cool beneath her bare feet. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, the only sound the gentle, rhythmic shushing of the waves. He didn't do it with his own hands, William said finally, his voice a low, empty murmur carried on the sea breeze. My father is a man who deals in control, not violence. He just let it happen. He knew the brakes on her car were faulty. He knew the road she took home from her studio was dangerous, especially in the rain. He could have sent a driver. He could have warned her. He did nothing. He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. He called it letting fate take its course. I called it murder. He turned to look at her, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. Since that day, I have sworn to never be like him, to never let emotion, love, make me weak, to never be powerless. I control everything, Jane, my business, my life, the people around me. It's the only way I know how to be safe. His confession was a raw, painful, and incredibly vulnerable admission. He was showing her the deepest, most broken part of his soul. And in his vulnerability, she found the courage to share her own. I know what it's like to feel powerless, she whispered, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She told him about her life, about how she had always been the responsible one, the caretaker. She told him about her mother's long illness, about her sister's rebellious streak, about her ex-boyfriend, Lucas, who had always relied on her to clean up his messes. I think, she confessed, the words tasting strange and new on her tongue, that no one has ever really taken care of me. The admission hung in the air between them, a quiet, heart-breaking truth. They were two sides of the same coin. He, a man who controlled everything to avoid feeling the pain of loss again. She, a woman who had been controlled by the needs of others, who had never had the luxury of being cared for. He stopped walking and turned to face her. The sound of the waves seemed to fade into the background. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. The touch was not possessive or controlling. It was tender, questioning. Maybe, he said, his voice a low, husky whisper that was barely audible over the sound of the sea. It's time that changed. And then he kissed her. It was not the impulsive, angry kiss she had imagined. It was not the passionate, claiming kiss from a romance novel. It was slow and gentle and filled with a decade of unspoken grief and a dawning, terrifying hope. It was a kiss that asked rather than took. A kiss that promised not passion, but sanctuary. And as his lips met hers, under the vast, silent, starry sky, Jane felt something she hadn't felt in her entire life. She felt safe. Com certeza. O refúgio foi encontrado. Mas o mundo real está prestes a invadir o paraíso. Jane awoke the next morning tangled in the soft linen sheets of William's bed, his arm draped protectively around her waist. The sun was streaming through the windows, the air was warm, and for the first time in her memory, she felt completely, utterly, and profoundly at peace. The walls between them had not just crumbled, they had evaporated. The cynical billionaire and the weary caretaker were gone. In their place were just Will and Jane. They spent the day in a blissful, sun-drenched bubble. They swam in the turquoise sea, their laughter echoing in the secluded cove. They cooked a simple lunch together in the villa's kitchen, arguing playfully over the right amount of garlic in the pasta sauce. He told her about his dream of one day leaving the corporate world behind and running a small boutique hotel, a place of quiet beauty like this one. She told him about her secret desire to open a small flower shop. They were simple, honest dreams, shared in the safety of their newfound intimacy. Jane was beginning to believe that this feeling of being seen, of being cared for, could be real. The illusion was shattered by the sharp, intrusive ringing of a satellite phone. William, who had been laughing at a story she was telling, instantly went still. The relaxed, happy man she had spent the day with vanished in a heartbeat. He stood up, his posture becoming rigid, his expression hardening into the familiar, cold mask of the CEO. He walked over to the phone, which his assistant had left on a charger in the corner. "Thorne?" he answered, his voice once again the clipped, authoritative tone she recognized from New York. He listened for a long moment, his back to her. "I see. No, that's unacceptable. Tell them the offer is final. If they don't accept by morning, we walk, and we acquire their competitor by noon." He was a different person. The transformation was so sudden, so complete. It was like watching a mask being lowered. He hung up the phone and turned to her, but the man from the beach was gone. The billionaire was back. "There's a problem with a merger in Tokyo," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all the warmth from moments before. "I have to go back." "Go back?" she asked, her heart sinking. "Now?" "The fantasy is over, Jane," he said, the words a cold, brutal splash of reality. He was already walking toward his room, his mind a million miles away, back in his world of deals and deadlines. "I have to get back to my life." Jane stood frozen in the middle of the beautiful, sun-drenched living room. The warmth of the day turned to ice in her veins. A fantasy. That's all this was to him. A brief, pleasant diversion before returning to his real life. She had been a fool. She had let her guard down, had allowed herself to believe that his vulnerability was a sign of change, not just a temporary crack in his armor. She had been just another acquisition, a short-term merger, and the contract was about to expire. The flight back to New York was the complete opposite of the flight to Italy. The silence was not one of tense anticipation, but of a cold, yawning chasm that had opened up between them. William was once again William Thorne, the CEO. He was immersed in his work, his laptop open, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, commanding murmur as he barked orders at subordinates across the globe. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak to her. It was as if the man who had held her hand during the turbulence, the man who had kissed her under the stars, had never existed. Jane sat across from him, a ghost in her own life once again. She felt like a fool, a naive, pathetic fool who had mistaken a moment of shared vulnerability for a promise of something real. He had called their time together a fantasy, and now, with his cold indifference, he was proving it. When the jet landed at the private airfield in New York, a black car was waiting on the tarmac. The city was gray, cold, and unforgiving, a perfect mirror of the feeling in her heart. She expected him to take her back to his penthouse, to the gilded cage where their strange story had begun. Instead, as the car navigated the city streets, he finally spoke, his eyes fixed on the traffic ahead. "I've arranged for you to stay at the Remington," he said, his voice flat, impersonal. "A suite has been prepared for you. You can stay for as long as you need." The Remington, one of his family's most exclusive, expensive hotels. The car pulled up to the grand entrance. A doorman rushed to open her door. William didn't get out. He didn't even look at her. He simply reached into his jacket and produced a sleek black credit card. "This should cover any expenses," he said, holding it out to her. "Consider it a thank you for the company." The words hit her like a physical slap. A thank you for the company. She was being dismissed, paid off. She was a transaction that had been completed. A cold, hard anger, an anger she hadn't felt since the day of her sister's wedding, rose up inside her, burning away the hurt. She would not be his charity case. She would not be a thank you he could write off as a business expense. She looked at the credit card in his outstretched hand, then at his cold, impassive face. "I'm not one of your business transactions, William," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. She didn't take the card. She simply got out of the car, her back straight, her head held high, and walked into the hotel without looking back, leaving him sitting alone in the back of his limousine with his cold, empty offer. She had nothing. No job, no home to go back to, no money. But she had her pride. And in that moment, it was the only thing she had left. Jane checked into the hotel using the last of her own savings, the irony not lost on her. She was staying at his hotel, but on her own terms. The suite was magnificent, but it felt like a beautiful, lonely prison. She spent the first day in a daze, her heart a heavy, aching stone in her chest. She knew she had to rebuild her life. She couldn't go back to her old apartment, which she had given up. She couldn't face her sister, not yet. She needed to be on her own 2 feet. She spent the next day polishing her resume, searching for jobs, determined to reclaim the independence she had so foolishly given up. But the world she had left behind had not forgotten her. Lucas, her ex-boyfriend, had been stewing in a toxic brew of humiliation and jealousy. The story of his fiancée abandoning him at the altar for a mysterious billionaire had become the stuff of gossip legend among their social circle. He was a laughingstock, and he blamed Jane. He found out she was back in town, and he decided to get his revenge. He didn't confront her directly. He did something far more insidious. He contacted a sleazy reporter from a notorious online gossip tabloid, a man he knew from his own shady business dealings. And he sold his story. The headline that appeared online the next morning was a brutal, character-assassinating bombshell. Jilted fiancé or gold-digging social climber. The truth about the runaway bridesmaid. The article, filled with fabricated quotes from concerned friends, painted a vicious picture of Jane. It portrayed her as a manipulative, ambitious woman who had been planning to leave Lucas all along. It claimed she had orchestrated the entire scene at the wedding to trap the wealthy William Thorne. It twisted her family's financial struggles into a narrative of desperation, making her seem like a predator who had targeted a billionaire in a moment of weakness. The story was a viral sensation. It was juicy, scandalous, and it confirmed every cynical suspicion people had about her. Jane saw it when she was in a coffee shop, preparing for a promising job interview. Her phone buzzed with notifications. She opened the link, and her world crumbled for the second time. Her name, her reputation, her private pain. It was all being twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable, laid bare for the entire world to see and judge. The phone rang. It was the HR department from the company where she had the interview. "Miss Miller." The woman's voice was cold, apologetic. "I'm afraid we're going to have to cancel your interview this afternoon. In light of the recent news, we don't feel you would be a good fit for our company's culture at this time." The line went dead. She sat there, frozen, the coffee cup trembling in her hand. Lucas hadn't just humiliated her. He had poisoned her. He had made her unemployable, a pariah. She was trapped, with no job, no money, and a reputation in tatters. She was completely, utterly, and devastatingly alone. Humiliated, unemployed, and with her savings dwindling rapidly, Jane was at her lowest point. She was trapped in a luxury hotel she could no longer afford, a prisoner of a scandal she did not create. She was about to call her sister to admit defeat, when there was a sharp, authoritative knock on her suite door. She opened it to find William Thorne. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He held a tablet in his hand, the screen glowing with the hateful headline of the tabloid article. "I saw the news," he said, his voice a low, furious rumble. He walked into the room, his presence filling the space. "This is my fault." "No," It's not, she said, her voice tired, hollow. It's Lucas's, and mine, forever trusting him. He used you to get at me, William countered, his jaw tight with a cold anger. This is a move on a chessboard, and you were the piece he chose to sacrifice. I should have anticipated it. I should have protected you. He looked at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the proud but weary set of her shoulders, and he saw not a victim, but a fighter who had been pushed to the brink. My father is threatening me, he confessed, the admission a surprise. He knows about you, about Italy. He sees you as a distraction, a liability. He has threatened to use his position on the board to ruin you professionally if I don't cut all ties. Jane felt a fresh wave of despair. Even William's father was against her. But, William continued, a new, dangerous glint in his eye, my father wants control. And the best way to fight a man who wants control is to give him exactly what he does not want. He looked at her, his expression shifting from anger to a cool, calculating intensity. I have a proposal for you, Jane, he said. A business proposal. He knelt in front of her, but it was not a romantic gesture. It was the move of a strategist, laying out his plan. Marry me, he said, his voice a low, compelling murmur. A contract, for 1 year. In public, we will be the perfect, devoted couple. It will protect you from the media storm. It will infuriate my father and neutralize his threats. It will give you a platform, a name, and the resources to rebuild your life. He paused, his eyes boring into hers. In exchange, you will give me the one thing I need to fight him. A stable, unassailable public image. It's a business deal, Jane. A merger of interests. She stared at him, her mind reeling. He was offering her a shield, a weapon, a way out of the nightmare. But the price was to tie herself to him, to enter into another lie, a cage far more permanent and more dangerous than the one she had just escaped. She thought of the cancelled job interview, of her dwindling bank account, of the smug, triumphant face of Lucas. She thought of William's father, another powerful man trying to control her life, and she was tired of being a victim. What are the terms? She asked, her voice quiet, but with a new hard edge of steel. He smiled, a slow, predatory smile. The terms are simple. We win. She looked at the man who had kissed her under the Italian stars, the man who was now offering her a contract of war. Was this the only way to reclaim her life? Or was she just stepping into an even bigger, more dangerous trap? The news of their engagement hit high society like a thunderclap. Billionaire William Thorne to wed runaway bridesmaid. The headlines were a mix of shock, scandal, and grudging admiration. William's father was reportedly furious, which only seemed to delight William more. Their wedding was the opposite of the fairy tale Jane had once planned. It was a swift, clinical affair in a judge's chambers, with only their lawyers as witnesses. The rules of their new contract were clear. A public performance of a loving marriage. Private lives kept completely separate. They would move back into William's penthouse, but she would have her own suite, her own space. It was a partnership, not a romance. Their first test as a married couple came a week later, at the annual Thorne Industries Gala, a command performance they could not avoid. As they entered the grand ballroom, a hush fell over the crowd. Jane, dressed in a stunning, deep red gown that radiated power, walked at William's side, her head held high. She was no longer the frightened, out-of-place girl from her sister's wedding. She was Mrs. William Thorne, and she played the part to perfection. It didn't take long for the true enemy to appear. William's father, a formidable, silver-haired man named Alistair Thorne, approached them, his eyes as cold and hard as chips of ice. "William," he said, his voice a low growl, completely ignoring Jane, "I see you went through with this foolishness." "Father," William replied, his own voice equally cold, "I'd like you to meet my wife, Jane." Alistair finally turned his gaze to Jane, looking her up and down with undisguised contempt. He leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for her. "I hope you got a very good prenuptial agreement, dear," he sneered, "because my son gets tired of his new toys very, very quickly." The insult was designed to make her shrink, to put her in her place. Instead, Jane smiled, a slow, brilliant smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Don't worry, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice sweet as poison. "I know exactly what your son is worth." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "And unlike some people, I have no intention of selling him." Alistair was so stunned by her audacity that he was momentarily speechless. He stared at her, then at his son, a look of furious disbelief on his face. The silent war between Jane and Alistair Thorne had just been declared. William, who had been bracing for a fight, looked at Jane with a new, profound admiration. He had offered her a shield, but he was quickly realizing she was a sword. He had thought he was acquiring a partner for his war, but he had just discovered he had found his general. He took her hand, lacing his fingers with hers, a gesture that was both for show and, for the first time, completely, undeniably real. "Shall we dance, my dear?" he murmured, a genuine, proud smile on his face. And as he led her to the dance floor, he knew that this marriage, this contract, had just become the most interesting and most dangerous game of his life. The confrontation with Alistair at the gala solidified their alliance. Jane was not a liability. She was a formidable asset, a partner who could meet the cold, calculating world of the Thornes with a steel of her own. William, in turn, became her staunchest defender, his public displays of affection for his wife becoming more frequent and more genuine, much to his father's increasing fury. But Jane refused to be just a beautiful weapon in his war. "This contract," she told him one evening in his study, "it says you will finance any project I want to start. I have a project." He looked at her, intrigued. "I'm listening." "I want to start a foundation," she said, her voice filled with a new, passionate purpose. "A foundation that provides legal aid, career counseling, and financial support for women whose lives and careers have been destroyed by public scandals, by abusive partners, by men like Lucas and your father." William was stunned. He had expected her to ask for a gallery, a boutique, something for herself. Instead, she wanted to build something for others. She wanted to turn her own pain into a source of strength for women who had none. "It's brilliant," he said, his voice filled with a genuine, profound admiration. "Absolutely brilliant." They threw themselves into the project. The Jane Thorne Foundation became their new shared battleground. He used his business acumen and his vast network to build the structure, to secure the funding, to navigate the complex legalities. She used her empathy, her intelligence, and her own painful experience to shape its mission, to design its programs, to be its heart and its soul. They worked side by side late into the night, their partnership evolving from a strategic alliance into a true, seamless team. The lines between their contract and their reality blurred until they were indistinguishable. The Foundation's launch event was a massive success. It was held at a rival hotel, a deliberate public declaration of their independence from the Thorne Empire. The press, which had once vilified Jane, now hailed her as a hero, a philanthropist, a champion for women. The highlight of the evening was a speech from the first woman the Foundation had helped, a young journalist who had been fired after a malicious smear campaign by a powerful executive. She stood on the stage, her voice trembling but strong. "The Jane Thorne Foundation didn't just give me a lawyer," she said, her eyes finding Jane in the crowd. "It gave me back my voice. It gave me back my life." She then turned her gaze to William, who stood beside Jane, his hand resting proudly on her back. "And thank you, Mr. Thorne," the journalist said, a small, knowing smile on her face, "for showing the world that the greatest investment a powerful man can make is in a powerful woman." The room erupted in applause. Later that night, after the event, William found Jane on the terrace of the penthouse, looking out at the city lights. "This isn't about my father anymore, is it?" he asked softly. "No," she replied, turning to him, her eyes shining. It hasn't been for a long time. This isn't a business deal for me either, Jane, he confessed, his voice a low, raw murmur. It hasn't been for a long time. He took a step closer, his heart in his eyes. This contract, our arrangement, it's not enough. I want more. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed with an urgent, jarring notification. The urgent notification on William's phone was a single, chilling headline from a financial news alert. Thorne Industries stock plummets amid hostile takeover rumors. He opened the link, his face hardening as he read. A rival corporation, secretly backed by his father, had launched a surprise, aggressive takeover bid for Thorne Industries. Alistair, furious at William's defiance and his marriage to Jane, was making his final move. He was trying to destroy William's empire from within, using his own vast resources and connections to orchestrate its downfall. He's trying to ruin me, William said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He's punishing me for choosing you. The next few days were a blur of frantic, high-stakes warfare. William was a man possessed, locked in his study for hours on end, on the phone with his lawyers, his bankers, his board members. He was fighting a battle on a dozen fronts, trying to fend off his father's ruthless attack. Jane watched, her heart aching, as the stress began to take its toll. The relaxed, happy man from Italy was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating CEO she had first met. He was retreating back into his armor, shutting her out. The wall between them, the wall she thought they had demolished, was being rebuilt, brick by painful brick. She tried to help, to offer her support, but he would just shake his head. "This is my world, Jane," he would say, his voice distant. "It's too dangerous for you." The final blow came late one night. He stumbled out of his study, looking utterly defeated. "He won," William said, his voice hollow. "He's consolidated enough shares. He's calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow to vote me out as CEO. It's over." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a profound, heartbreaking despair. "He told me there's one way out," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "One deal he's willing to make." "What is it?" she asked, a cold dread creeping into her heart. "He wants me to annul our marriage," he confessed, the words like poison on his tongue. "He wants me to issue a public statement saying it was all a mistake, a temporary insanity. If I do that, if I erase you from my life, he'll call off the takeover." He was being forced to choose, his empire, his life's work, or her. He looked at her, his face a mask of agony. "I built this company, Jane. It's everything I am." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. He was telling her what he stood to lose. He was, in his own broken way, asking her what he should do. Jane looked at the man she loved, at the man who had been so broken by his past that he had built an empire to protect himself. And she knew what she had to do. She would not be the reason for his ruin. "I understand," she whispered, her heart shattering into a million pieces. "You have to save your company." She was releasing him. She was giving him an out. She was sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of his legacy, an act of love so profound it was almost unbearable. The morning of the board meeting was gray and cold, a perfect mirror of the mood in the penthouse. William stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the knot of his tie, his movements stiff, robotic. He was dressed for war, but his eyes were hollow, the eyes of a man who had already lost. Jane had packed a small bag. She was ready to leave, to disappear from his life as quietly as she had entered it. She had given him his freedom, his out. The pain was a physical ache in her chest, but she would not let him see her cry. He walked out of his room and saw her standing by the door, her bag at her feet. "So this is it," he said, his voice rough. "It's what you have to do," she replied, her own voice a trembling whisper she couldn't quite control. "Protect your company. Protect your legacy." He walked over to her, stopping just a few feet away. He looked at her brave, heartbroken face, and something inside him finally, irrevocably, snapped. "No," he said, his voice a low, fierce growl. He strode past her, grabbed his briefcase, and walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the handle, and looked back at her. "My father," he said, his voice ringing with a new, powerful conviction, spent his life chasing a ghost, terrified of a love he couldn't control. He built an empire of cold, hard steel. But my mother, she taught me that a life without passion, without love, isn't a life at all. It's just a balance sheet." He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a fire she had never seen before. "He can have his company. He can have his steel and his glass. He can have his empty, lonely empire." He dropped his briefcase to the floor with a loud, definitive thud. "I choose you, Jane," he declared, his voice full of a love so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. "I choose us. I choose the messy, chaotic, beautiful life we have together. And if that means losing everything else, then so be it. Let it all burn." He walked back to her, his face transformed by a smile that was both reckless and radiant. He took her face in his hands. "Our contract is over," he whispered. "Our war is over." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. He hadn't planned this. It was an impulsive, desperate, and utterly perfect act. He opened it to reveal a simple, elegant diamond ring. "This is not a business deal," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is not a strategy. This is my heart. Jane Miller, will you marry me? Not as a partner in a war, but as my partner in life." Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She was laughing, sobbing, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Yes," she cried. "Yes, William. 1,000 times, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was not a shackle. It was a promise of a future they would build together, from the ashes of the empire he had just willingly sacrificed for her. The news of William Thorne's abdication sent shockwaves through the financial world. He had walked away from his own empire, allowing his father to win the hostile takeover, and had simply disappeared. The business world called him a fool. His father called him a disgrace. Jane called him her husband. 1 year later, Jane stood on the tarmac of a small private airfield. She was not running away. She was waiting. A small, sleek jet, far more modest than the one that had first carried her away, was being prepared for takeoff. She heard footsteps behind her and turned, a brilliant, happy smile on her face. William walked toward her, not in a power suit, but in a simple, comfortable sweater and jeans. He was carrying a small travel bag in one hand and a bouquet of wildflowers in the other. "Ready to go, Mrs. Thorne?" he asked, his eyes sparkling with a light she had never seen in his old life. "More than ready," she replied, taking the flowers and inhaling their sweet, wild scent. They had spent the last year building a new life, far from the noise and the poison of New York high society. They had bought the small villa in Italy, the place where they had first truly found each other. William, using the personal fortune he had retained, had transformed it. The once impersonal house was now a warm, vibrant home, and he had fulfilled his mother's dream, converting a large portion of the estate into a renowned artist's retreat, a place of creativity and healing. Jane's foundation was thriving, now operating internationally, managed by a board she trusted, allowing her to focus on what she loved most, helping women find their voice. As they boarded the jet, Jane paused and looked back at the life they were leaving behind for their annual trip home. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The power? The empire?" William followed her gaze, then looked down at her, his hand coming to rest gently on her stomach, where a new life was just beginning to grow. "My father spent his life building an empire of steel and glass," he said, his voice full of a quiet, profound peace. "He never understood that a true legacy isn't something you build, it's something you grow." He smiled, a genuine happy smile that reached the depths of his soul.